Making sure. All right. I couldn't hear it very well. Sorry. My name is Matt, and I'm a sinner. Good. All right. Some of you have been to AA meetings. Okay. Now we're going to try this again. All right. What you're going to do, I'm going to say, my name is Matt, and I'm a sinner. And you're going to say, just with so much enthusiasm, because you understand yourself as a sinner as well, you're going to say, hello, Matt. All right? So my name is Matt, and I'm a sinner. Now, I think we can do better than that. All right. Some of you may not recognize that you're sinners. My name is Matt, and I'm a sinner. Okay, that's very good. Now, sometimes, sometimes I get angry when I don't get my way. Anybody else in the room? Okay, some of you are just dishonest. I can be impatient, and I can also interrupt pretty badly. These issues I'm learning as I get older stem primarily from control problems, which I do have. Sometimes I enjoy a pat on the back just a little too much. I don't like feeling insignificant, and I don't like to be perceived as weak. And I can be honest about these things, and I can be open about these things because I know that I have been forgiven. And I know that as I constantly change over time, I am continuing to be forgiven. And this is the reason that I am able to worship. So we are in part 5 of a 6-week series titled Church on Purpose. We are discussing the mission and the message of the church, and today specifically what we're going to talk about is worship. And our last service, our first service, was off the chain. Am I too old to say that? Are people still even saying that? They are. Some of you are nodding no. I guess it depends on your age, all right? Well, it was. What is that noise? Is that me? Yeah, I know I must be old. Yeah. Okay, well, you want me to grab a handheld? Okay. I'm going to grab this one. Maybe. Okay, now, so we are in part 5 of our series, Church on Purpose, and what we're discussing is the purpose of the church, the mission, and the message of the church. So primarily, there are 2 things that we've been focusing on the last few weeks. First, what is the purpose of the church, capital C? Why is it that we're here? This global church, this idea of the larger church, the universal church. Why is it that the church exists? And we talk about this during a time when often the church is considered to be more irrelevant than ever. But what we're also trying to do more specifically is drill down and talk about what is the purpose of this church. Why around 10 years ago was this church planted in eastern Kentucky? What was the original vision of this church? And what is the direction that we are moving in now? At the beginning of the year, we opened up with a vision series called Reach, Serve, Grow. And what we've tried to do is remind you of some of the things that are central to who we are as we've moved into this series in the fall. So today I want to discuss the importance of worship. And here is the unique thing about worship that's going to make it a little bit different than everything else that we've talked about. Because we've talked about evangelism, we've talked about discipleship, we've talked about what it means to live in the kingdom of God. Next week we're going to talk about unity. But this is what makes worship a little bit different. It's the only topic that we're going to discuss
that is just as common outside of the church. And what I mean by that is we all worship something. You may not recognize this in your life. You call yourself a Christian. Many of you in here do. And your assumption is that the number one thing that you worship in your life, or the thing that is the most important to you, is your worship of Jesus or your worship of God. And often this is not the case. Often what we worship outside of the church is even more significant. So if you're wondering what it is that you worship in your life, there are two very simple ways that we can look at what worship. Where is my time and where is my money? So whenever we take into consideration our resources and what we're actually doing with our time, we have a really strong understanding of the things that we worship. Some people worship their children. Some people worship their spouse. There are all of these different things that we actually worship. Consider where your time is and consider where your money is. Now, recently I looked at the top 5 things that Americans actually worship, and unfortunately, Jesus is nowhere close to the top 5. So these are the top 5 things that Americans actually worship, and we'll start with number 5. Americans worship guns. All right, Americans love guns. Number 4, they either worship what they drive, what they want to drive, or what someone else drives. We constantly think about cars or automobiles. If we get into looking at social media, the magazines that we buy, the movies that we watch, the shows that we stream, and all of this other stuff, we look at celebrities and fame. There is this addiction and this worship that we constantly pour into that. And then if you look at number 1 and number 2, they are both sports. College sports, number 2, professional sports being number 1. I would like to point out, and I had completely forgot about this, but Allie, whenever she left after the first service, Pastor Alex, his wife, he is actually at a Bengals game right now. All right, so make sure that you mention that to him whenever he gets back. He sent a text back saying, well, it's only once a year. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I said, no, tell him to go have a good time. He needs to have a good time. But anyway, these are the top 5 things that we actually worship, mentioning that Jesus is nowhere close to the top of this list. I had a former neighbor, whenever I first moved here, I rented one of those apartments across from Pig and a Poke where you see like the water wheel in town. And I had a neighbor who had a new Harley, and he worshiped that motorcycle like nothing I've ever seen in my life. It's like he spent all of his time cleaning that motorcycle and buying accessories and things for that motorcycle. And every single time I got close to it just to try to get to my car, he looked at me like he wanted to kill me. I mean, it was that significant. And that's the way that a lot of people are with their possessions. They worship their stuff. I know people who worship their phones. And recently I was looking at in 2018, the statistics of what is an average amount of time that an American spends on screen time a day. It's around 3 hours and 35 minutes a day. So if you spend around 3 hours and 35 minutes a day on your phone, that's about average. Now, what a lot of you are going to find if you actually look at your phone is that you spend a lot more time looking at screens than that, which would actually make you an addict. So be very careful when you're pointing at other forms of addiction, because this is a pretty serious form of addiction as well. Some people worship their pets, and I'm just going to be completely honest with you, and I love you. I don't get that, all right? I don't understand what that's all about. It's supposed to be funny, all right? We have some pet lovers in here, all right? But some people literally, they dress their pets up all the time. They spend all of their money on their pets, and this is just the way that a lot of people live, all right? We worship all these things. So throughout history and today, there are many different ways that Christians actually worship. There is traditional versus contemporary worship, this being a contemporary church. There is liturgical versus charismatic worship, or really, really structured worship, like the worship here is more structured, versus spontaneous worship. And this is what a lot of you grew up in. Sister Ethel wants to stand up and give a testimony. She'll talk for 45 minutes. A lot of times, or some churches have runners that are going to run around the place. A lot of times prayer requests will go a really long time. This is what you would consider to be spontaneous worship. There is quiet worship versus loud worship. There is individual worship, and this is when you're in your shower and you're worshiping. We don't need to know any more about that. Or whenever you're listening to worship music and you're riding down the road in your car and you're just praising Jesus and the tears are flowing and all that. And there is also this idea of corporate worship, which is what we are doing here today. Now, in the New Testament, there are 5 different forms of worship that we need to understand. The first is the worship of the Word. So whenever we take this book, the desire that we have, because this is a mistake that we make, for a lot of people, whenever they look at worship, what that means is the time that the band's up here. Or if you go to a different kind of church, the time that the choir's up here, or whoever it might be. But whenever we take this book out, like we are right now, and we're learning from this is worship. All right, there is also the cup. And what I mean by that is communion, or the Lord's Supper, or the more formal term, the Eucharist, which is what we're going to be celebrating. We're going to have communion next Sunday. This is another form of worship. We also have, what we have just mentioned, the songs. Whenever we have the band up here, you have a choir, you have a special, you're singing hymns corporately, whatever that might look like, we have that part of worship. We also have this next part that we don't like to talk about as worship, and that's the offering and the tithe. So whenever we take up money and whenever we collect, this is also a strong part of worship. In fact, on Sundays, everything that we do here, with the exception of the announcements, falls into a category of worship. And then the 5th one here is unity. And what that means is that whenever we come together corporately as a body, and Paul is talking about this in Colossians where we're going to be today, we are to unify together. If I have an enemy in this room or in this church or a problem with another believer, it is my responsibility to make that relationship right, because that's what we're supposed to be doing as believers. We don't do that often enough. In fact, I would make the argument that whenever we talk about the church declining and all of the issues that we see, it's not because we're irrelevant, it's not because we're not teaching the right things, it's not because of this, it's not because of that, it's because Christians hate one another. Let's just be real. If you don't agree with me or you don't believe that, just get a Twitter account. And you'll know in a very short period of time we disagree about everything, we don't like one another, between denominations, between differences, and actually unity is what we're going to be talking about next week as an important part of church on purpose. All right, so we are going to be in the book of Colossians today, Colossians chapter 3, and I'm actually going to start in verses 15 through 17 and talk a little bit about the how of worship, like that part right there, and then we're going to get to something more significant. We're going to skip forward to verses 1 through 4, and we're going to talk about the why of worship. Why is it that we actually worship? So what Paul is actually doing here is he's discussing what it means to rid ourselves of the old person and to live completely fully into the new person. So I opened up today with a little bit of vulnerability, trying to talk about some of my struggles and some of the issues that I have for the purpose of letting you guys know that I am being renewed on a regular basis every single day of my life. I am not the same person that I was a year ago. I'd like to think that I'm not even the same person that I was a month ago, and you guys can say the exact same thing, hopefully many of you, about where you are. We do this through discipline. Last week we talked about the spiritual disciplines, and I gave you guys that rule of life that you could follow. Did anybody in here take that serious and fill it out, and you're like trying to apply that to your life? All 7 of us? Wonderful. That's great. All right, but for the 7 of you, 6 of you that did that, this will absolutely transform and change the way that you see the Christian life. All right, so Colossians chapter 3, verses 15 through 17, this is what Paul is saying whenever he talks about worship. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body, you were called to peace. And be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms and hymns and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God through the Father through him. So specifically, there are 4 things that we are looking at whenever we're discussing worship. All right, this is what worship is supposed to be so that you understand what it looks like. The first is this. Worship is a movement toward peace. And we've already talked about this a little bit. So before you're ever ready to raise your hand, before those tears start streaming, before you internally gather yourself and you have a certain way of worshiping, you may not even be singing the songs, before you decide you're going to take 10 laps around the church, I grew up in a culture of runners. All right, there were people that would run around the church. There were a lot of shouters. That was the kind of church that I grew up in. If you didn't do that, you were dead. All right, that's the way that it was looked at. All right, but we are constantly moving toward peace. And what this means is that if you have a difficult problem with someone that is in this room right now, or in this church, or another believer, you have the responsibility and the obligation to make that right. Because it's very difficult to raise your hands in worship or to start singing certain songs or act like you are holier than thou when you have a serious issue with a brother or sister that is also within the faith. And this is an issue. This is a problem that we have in churches all across this country and in churches all across the world. Is there is this understanding that there's not an understanding that we are to make peace among our brothers and sisters, but we are also supposed to love our enemies outside of the faith. There is also supposed to be this proclamation of gratitude. And this is so huge in worship. A lot of the reasons that we are able to worship is because we are thankful for the things that God has done in our lives. We are thankful that He has saved us. We are thankful that He has changed us. We are thankful that we have healthy children. We are thankful that we are healthy ourselves. We are thankful that He continues to provide for us over and over again. Some of us are thankful because for a long time, we really prayed about a spouse, and now we're married. Some of us are thankful because of the job that we have. The blessings of God is what we would call this. There is a gratitude element that is a really important part of worship. There is also saturation in the Word. And saturation in the Word means that every time we are coming together, we are taking this book, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, we are internalizing what is here. And we are not just simply reading what is here, but we are taking what is here and we are applying it to our lives. And then, of course, what we always think of, it is the lifting of songs. All right, it is the singing of songs. It's the praise in that way. So as we consider these important components of worship, which, like I said, they're really, really important, it's more important to understand why we worship. Why in the world is it that we worship? Why in the world can I come in here on any given Sunday and see Marcy, who always has this beautiful smile on her face when she's worshiping, like she understands why she's worshiping, and she's raising her hands, and then other people have their hands in their pockets, and they're kind of moving back and forth, and they're wondering, when in the world am I going to get to sit down and take a break? And they have no understanding of worship whatsoever. So why is it that we actually worship? For that, I want us to look at the first 4 verses here, because this is absolutely critical to understanding what it means to have church on purpose. This is what it says. Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your heart on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. So there is a place that your heart is intentionally supposed to be, but not just your heart. Set your mind on the things above and not on earthly things. So the reason that a lot of people are not able to worship the way that we're supposed to worship is because all of their thoughts, their actions, their attitudes, and everything they are surface around down here. What am I going to eat next? What am I going to watch next? When am I going to get that raise that I'm supposed to get? Why do I have such a difficult time getting along with so-and-so? Where are we going on our vacation next? How are we going to deal with this particular problem? Whenever our minds and our hearts at all times are supposed to be elevated into another dimension. But why? Why are our hearts and minds supposed to be in this place? And how does it make sense to understand this place? This is what Paul says. For you died. You died to those things. You are supposed to be dead to those things. You don't return to those things. For your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is in your life, appears, then also you will appear with Him in glory. So there are 2 primary things that we must understand about the why of worship. This is what it is right here. Whenever you come in here on Sunday mornings, or whenever you're listening to Hillsong or Bethel or Passion or whatever it might be in your car, in the shower, while you're cleaning your home, whatever it might be, this is why you are worshiping. You are worshiping because of a present reality that you must experience every day of your life. And if you don't experience this present reality every day of your life, there are deeper questions about who you are and the nature of who you are spiritually. But not simply this present reality, but also this future promise. So whenever you see people that are able to come in here and they're passionate about worship and they're excited and they're just ready and they can't wait and they know that they're lifting up God, it's because of this present reality and this future promise that I want us to understand today. So first, this present reality, if we look at Colossians 3, verses 1 and 3, this is what it says. You have been raised with Christ, for you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. So this is our present reality. We worship for the purpose of glorifying the God that has saved us and changed our lives. So this present reality that we have, if we are believers, is that our lives are not what they used to be. The guilt, the fear, the shame, the accusations, the addictions, whatever it might look like, once we are in Christ and we are being made new, we are no longer in that former life. And for those of us that are in Christ, this is a constant and daily reminder of who we are. Now, I mentioned some struggles that I have at the beginning of this message, and you guys have your whole list of struggles too. So this doesn't make us perfect, but it means that we are constantly being delivered from these things. And people who are not able to worship are not able to worship because they are not constantly being delivered from these kinds of things. So we are not simply singing songs and practicing rituals. We are participating in a completely new way of life that we have in Christ. All right, so every day of our lives, in one form or another, should be an act of worship. You should be able, whenever you get up in the morning and you're getting your kids ready for school, if you're listening to worship music or you've just done your quiet time, you should be able to worship. Or if you're riding down the road and you're by yourself and you need that time with God and you need to talk to Him and then you turn on your music or whatever it might be, you need that time to worship. But here's what's so special about Sunday and what makes Sunday significant or any other church day is that we are collectively coming together as a corporate body to worship together. And some of you in here, you completely get that. Like you understand the importance of it. And others of you, unfortunately, you just don't get it. Like it's completely new to you because you're not a Christian, or you made a profession of faith maybe years ago, but it's never something that you actually stepped out in yourself. So therefore, whenever you see people raising their hands, you wonder why the worship is going so long and not ending, and you start to become frustrated with that. It's because you haven't had these same experiences. So worship isn't always about expressing emotion. Like it doesn't always have to be this wonderful, magnetic, energetic feeling like what we had at the conclusion of our first service this morning, but it always has to do with the posture of your heart and the preparation that goes into things before you ever even enter the building on a Sunday morning. So it doesn't matter how we do it, it's the direction at which we do it. All right? And maybe this is still all confusing. Like, why in the world do people do worship? Why do they do it? Why in the world is it that that person has tears streaming down their cheeks? It makes no sense whatsoever. And as I told you, whenever we began this series, I can completely relate to that because I was out of church for many years, for like 10 years. And the only time that I would actually go to church, I would usually go with my dad because he would like beg me to go. And my dad you have to know my dad. He's a very emotional worshiper. All right, so my dad is the kind of guy, I'm standing right beside him, and he's got his hands out like this, and like there are all these tears coming down, and he's like actually not singing the songs. He's actually like loudly praying to where I can't tell the difference between what's going on up there on the screens and what's going on coming out of his mouth. But sometimes I'm looking at him, and I'm like, why in the world is he so passionate about this? And why don't I feel that way? Like, why is there nothing within me that experiences like that same kind of joy or that same kind of thankfulness or gratitude, or that same kind of excitement? Why is it that I don't feel those kinds of emotions? So a few questions that I want you guys to consider this morning, and not to answer out loud, but just to consider. Have you ever had a life-changing encounter with Christ? Have you ever had that? And I'm not asking, have you prayed a prayer at some point? I'm not asking, do you go to Destination Community Church on a regular basis and maybe even volunteer? I'm not asking, do you really, really try to be a good person and you're an even better person today than you were 2 years ago? I'm not asking anything like that. I'm not asking if you were raised in church. I'm asking, was there a transformative experience in your heart where your shame, your fear, your guilt, your struggles were completely washed away and you were able to take this gigantic, deep breath and really understand that everything was new? And then when you talked about people, or then when you went back to trying to do some of the things that you used to do, then when you tried to go back to that physical relationship with the boyfriend or the girlfriend, there was something inside of you telling you that you were made for more than what that is. You see, that's why people are able to worship. Have you been to the cross? Have you really been to the cross? Not close, not looking at it a little bit from the distance. Have you really been to the cross? Have you felt the weight of your guilt and shame removed? Anybody can worship when they've experienced that. Have you been able to rejoice over an answered prayer? You see, this is what it means to worship. And you know, more than any of these things are the individuals that whenever they are going through the greatest amount of suffering in their lives, it feels like everything is falling apart, they are able to worship. Several years ago, whenever my wife and I first got married, we went to marriage counseling that saved our marriage. But the pastor, he mentioned this that we were seeing. It was kind of off topic. But he said, you guys know what worship is? He said, you know how people, they'll get up, the choir gets up, the band gets up, whatever kind of church you go to, the person gets up and does a special, whatever, you know, and they worship, and people may stand up and sing along or raise their hands or go to the altar and all that kind of stuff. He's like, that's great. He said, but you want to know what genuine worship is? And we're like, what? What is genuine worship? He's like, when you get that diagnosis that you know you've only got a few weeks to live or a few months to live, whenever you know that you've been given a diagnosis and you know that you're going to live a long life, but this is the way things are going to be for the rest of your life. Whenever you know that your child or your parent or someone in your life has really, really hurt you, when you know that you've taken a major financial loss and you're able to get down on your knees, I might not get back up, by the way. Whenever you're able to get down on your knees and you're able to say, it is well with my soul, your will be done. You see, that is what worship looks like. That is what genuine commitment looks like. And whenever we understand these things and we're able to internalize what this means, we're starting to get that present reality. We're starting to understand what it means. And whenever we come in here in a completely different way. It's so insignificant at that point to argue with the spouse. And you're saying right now, well, you don't know what he did this morning. It's so insignificant at that point to argue about money. It's so insignificant to get mad at your child or your wife or your husband because they were running late this morning. It's so insignificant to argue about what you might be having for dinner or lunch after church. All of these things are insignificant when our hearts are prepared. So this reach portion of our vision, we've talked the last few weeks about reach, serve, grow, and what we are. And you want to know something? We can have the best coffee, we can have the nicest people, but until we have a contagious form of worship in which people understand what they have really been delivered from, this church can't change. This church has to stay stuck where it is. So we have this beautiful present reality that we have to recognize, but we also have this future promise, and this is where it gets really good. All right, especially when things are going rough. So Colossians 3:4 says this: when Christ, who is in your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. This is what it's saying. We worship because of the promise of eternal life that we have. So it's wonderful knowing that Jesus is changing us, that Jesus has changed us, and that Jesus is changing us. It's wonderful knowing that we are living into the fullness of our identity. It's wonderful knowing that we are never going to be the same and we are going to continue to get closer and closer to Jesus. But there are times when things are really hard here, when we long for home. There are times whenever we are really struggling and don't know what to do, but we know with certainty that we are going to heaven when we die. So we can talk about the hymns that we sing or the worship songs that we sing or the messages that we hear, but we can worship because we know there is a better place, there is a kingdom for us beyond this world. So whenever I walk into this place and I have an understanding that Jesus has died for my sins and I'm living within this present reality, and I have an understanding that regardless of how bad life may get, with all of the suffering, difficulty, and evil in this world, that one day I'm spending eternity in this goodness, how can I not worship? How does it make any sense whatsoever to sit there with my arms crossed while other people are standing up praising God? How does that make any sense whatsoever? Well, it's very simple. We've not been to the cross, and we don't have an understanding of what that looks like. So when we are worshiping, we are moving toward peace with one another. It has to happen. This is where we have to start. We have a proclamation of gratitude, or we are thanking God for the blessings that are in our lives. We are being saturated in this book and learning what it means to truly follow Jesus. And we are lifting him up in songs. And we do this because Jesus saved us, and Jesus eternally keeps us. The reality of the present and the future promise. So what is it that we do with this information? And how is it that you can benefit, or how is it that you can understand a real picture of what it means to worship? The first thing I would do is ask a question to some of you. Have you experienced the change that Jesus brings? Because this is where we have to start. Have you actually experienced it? I'm not asking you if you're a good person. I'm not asking you if you help out in kids ministry. I'm not asking you if you volunteer for security. I'm not asking you if you participate in a small group. I'm not asking you if you attend and help out with Celebrate Recovery. I'm not asking any of those things. I'm asking, have you experienced inner transformation that only Jesus can bring? Because this is what it means to have church on purpose. And if we don't understand this, we are religious consumers and we never really have an understanding of what it means to worship. So for those that know that you've experienced this, the second thing, we must prepare, really the first thing for believers, we must prepare our hearts for worship. And the truth is that the majority of us come in here so rushed on Sunday mornings, like every other area of our lives, that we come in here with no preparation for worship whatsoever. I'm always interested in looking at different things that athletes do to prepare for a game, like how LeBron James, a lot of times it's superstition, a lot of times it's the kind of music that they're listening to, a lot of times it's the conditioning or the routines or whatever it is that they may have before games, but every single one of us needs something like this as we prepare our hearts for worship. If I'm walking in here arguing with one of my kids or my spouse, if I walk in here and I'm more concerned about the coffee that I'm going to get than the Jesus that I'm going to celebrate, if these are the things that are on my mind, or standing around talking in the lobby, there is nothing that is ever going to be said in that lobby that is as important as what's going to be said in here. And that is something that we need to understand. So how are you preparing your heart for worship? Now, I have bored you guys often with this story, but telling you about my little routine that I have on Sunday mornings. Whenever I get up, I'll pray at the house about what we're going to be doing. After I pray at the house, the next thing that I do is I drive down to Food City and walk around like a very, very strange man, not buying anything. And my grandmother always said to me whenever I was a kid, you need to take the time to smell the roses. So what I always do is I open up the case and I just inhale like 10 good breaths. It must look like the most bizarre thing ever, but I literally smell the roses. Then I leave, I go get my coffee at McDonald's, and I go down behind Billy Ray's down by the river, and I pray. I think there's a song titled something like that. So I go down there and I pray, and by the time I come in here, like my heart is ready to go. Somebody can say, something just happened back in here, something just happened over here, which happens almost every Sunday morning, but there's a certain level of focus that I have because I am preparing to walk in, understanding the sacrifice that Jesus made for me, but also understanding my future promise. But also our worship must be about promises and not feelings. Because it's really easy to go into an environment and you feel that electricity and you feel that energy, and the band is just really great that day, or the message was really great that day, and it feels like you're feeding into that energy, but you're not necessarily holding on to those two promises that we just talked about. That Jesus is in the process of transforming and changing your life, and one day you are going to be in glory with Him forever. So we need to focus on promises opposed to feelings. Our worship must be, at all times, prepared celebration of our experience with the promises of God. These promises must be internalized. These promises must be something that we are focusing on. These promises must overcome and outreach everything that we're watching on Netflix, or everything that we're looking at on our phone, and our children, and our spouses, and our jobs, and all of the other things in our lives. We have to focus on these two things, and we understand what it means to worship. And this is also what it means to have church on purpose. So what I'd like to ask you to do is just bow your head and close your eyes for just a minute. And what we're going to do first is we're going to have just a brief